Howdy, I'm Anime Games Aiden, and if you grew up in the late 2000s/early 2010s like me, you probably watched a ton of video game content on YouTube back in the day. Plenty of reviewers and YouTube channels were willing to give you their opinions of what they thought of each game. Though when watching these videos as a kid, I noticed that a small handful of games were constantly dragged through the mud, and being an impressionable youth, I went a long time thinking that all these games were bad. It wasn't until I got older and learned how to form an opinion of my own did I decide to check these games out. Some were as bad as the reviewers said, games like Ninja Gaiden 3. I mean, this game is trash and almost every reviewer was right about it at the time. There were some games they disliked that I thought were okay, a game like Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. A game like this isn't abhorrently bad, but I can understand the heavy dislike for it at the time. I mean, there's nothing special here. And finally, some games that weren't bad at all. Some that were actually quite enjoyable. And those are the games I want to talk about today. The games that almost all the reviewers trashed on back in the 2010s, but they were actually worth playing all along. Now, just a heads up before I continue. None of these games are 10 out of 10s. They're just games that fall under the category of overhated, but not underrated. With that being said, let's jump into our first game. Alright, so I'm probably going to ruffle a couple of feathers with this game, because Final Fantasy XIII is pretty hated, but we're going to run a quick little experiment before discussing the game, one that you, the audience, can take part in. Now, raise your hand if you dislike Final Fantasy XIII. Quite a few hands there, I'm sure. Now keep that hand raised if you actually played Final Fantasy XIII. I can guarantee that a decent amount of hands went down, and don't be ashamed because I used to be a part of that group. The hate for Final Fantasy XIII is so strong that even people who haven't touched the game hate it, which is pretty sad since this game isn't that bad. Hell, it's not even the worst Final Fantasy mainline game. 2 gladly wears that crown of shit with honor. 13 is just a unique game. It's a JRPG with this very cinematic and stylish focus on narrative. The combat is flashy, but isn't as brain dead as everyone says. That's not to say that it's mentally taxing. You just need to put some level of brain power and strategy into each fight, especially when some of the bosses will require you to constantly switch paradigms on the fly. I can't argue against the game being extremely linear, but 10 was linear too, and we all loved it. Granted, 10 had an amazing story and characters that held your interest the entire way, but 13's story isn't god-awful. It's certainly not good, but I was at least engaged and curious to see where things were going. Final Fantasy XIII is definitely a flawed game, but not as flawed as many reviewers in the past made it sound. I'd recommend giving it a shot if you're a fan of story-heavy RPGs and want something a little different from the norm, especially so my boy Snow can get some much-needed love. Okay, I've got a personal axe to grind with this one because everyone keeps making videos about how Resident Evil 5 is this underrated masterpiece and we should all go out and play it right now, while Operation Raccoon City is barely getting any recognition. This game was so heavily panned back in the day, and it didn't deserve any of the hate it got, because I think it's a solid B-movie zombie game. Now you're probably sitting there wondering what a B-movie zombie game is. We know how there's stuff like 28 Days Later and Night of the Living Dead and how they're considered these top-tier zombie movies, since they're more artistically driven. You know, with 28 Days Later being about man and him reverting back to being a primal being, and Night of the Living Dead being about racism. Well, that's basically the mainline Resident Evil games. But you also have B-movie zombie movies, films like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, and all those other wonderful films. Well, Operation Raccoon City is kind of like that to me. Not a high-quality film, but an enjoyable one. In Operation Raccoon City, you play as an elite strike unit of the Umbrella Company, one that is sent to erase the existence of Umbrella operating in Raccoon City. That's right, if you know anything about Resident Evil lore, you're playing as the worst thing imaginable. Capitalist. Seeing as you're a private military squad sent to rewrite history, that means you're playing as the bad guys, which is pretty refreshing not just for Resident Evil, but also zombie games in general. I mean, you're spreading chaos throughout the city mid-apocalypse, just so Mr. Krabs' stock doesn't go down a percent. And what's really cool is how the game fully embodies this through the gameplay. You have to deal with both zombies and the special forces sent in to save the city, and the game juggles these two types of enemies pretty well. When fighting soldiers, the game plays like a normal third-person shooter. But if you wound a soldier and cause them to start bleeding, this will actually attract nearby zombies, and they'll start attacking your enemies. But be careful, because this applies to you too. This game is just pure chaos, but in a fun way. In one level, your squad is sent to City Hall to go burn some documents that show Umbrella was there, you know, the usual business. But near the end, this Russian guy bamboozles you, and then he releases a bunch of liquors, and then he sets the whole building on fire, and it's just pure madness! And I love it. Now, while you may be playing as the Resident Evil equivalent to John Wick, when you see a horde of flaming liquors come at you and start chasing you, yeah, you're probably going to react the same way as I did. I should probably preface that this game isn't scary like people are expecting, but it is very thrilling. Also, I can kind of understand why this game was hated at the time it came out. This was when Resident Evil was sort of having a dark age. The mainline games weren't doing so well, so when it was announced that Resident Evil was getting this squad-based third-person shooter, I can understand why many fans were upset. They definitely wanted something closer to the survival horror they had come to know and love. If this game had been released after Resident Evil 7, or if the series had been viewed more favorably at the time, I could see it getting a much better reception when it released. With that being said, I definitely recommend checking this game out if you're a fan of Resident Evil, or you just enjoy shooters like the Left 4 Dead series. Even though it's meant to be played with friends, I've always played this game alone and found it to still be a blast.
Alright, get it together if you want to be extracted.
Alright, let me be one of the few to say this. DMC Devil May Cry is a good game, and I'm tired of pretending it's not. The amount of people that claim that DMC is the worst Devil May Cry is pretty baffling, especially when this exists in the same series. Yeah, DMC's the worst game in the Devil May Cry franchise. With that being said, DMC does a lot of good. The combat is great and feels like a sort of basis for DMC 5. You see, 1 and 2's combat feels a little dated if you go back and play it today, and while 3's is pretty solid, it's still kind of held back by the hardware of its era. 4 felt really good in comparison, but it was obvious that the series needed to shake it up a bit and sort of modernize. And that's what DMC did. Its combat is very fluid and fast, and when you pair this with Dante's new Angel and Devil grabs, encounters just zoom by, and in a good way. It's so good in my opinion that the only DMC game to actually top it was 5, the game to come out after it. But people don't generally complain about DMC's combat. They more complain about the story. You see, DMC decided to be a more contemporary story about demons in our government and how the corporations are trying to suppress our individualism. And it did all this with a sort of left-leaning tone. And even both sides of the political spectrum agreed that it was pretty bad. Yeah, it was a little polarizing at the time, especially considering how DMC 1 through 4 had no political talk whatsoever. But here's the thing. I actually like this game's story. Oh, not for the intended reason. I just think it's so bad it loops back to being funny.
You don't look a day over 12,000.
Fuck you!
Fuck you!
Fuck you!
There's just something in my brain that loves horribly written schlock like this, Freddy Got Fingered, and The Room. DMC wants to be this serious game that's all about fighting the man. But instead it comes off as the schizoid ramblings of a UC Berkeley student. I mean, one of the game's missions involves you killing their version of Bill O'Reilly.
I'm taking you off the air.
You think so? I wouldn't bet on it, you little shit.
I mean, for fuck's sake, you even go through a goddamn Chinese knockoff of the fucking Fox News logo to fight him. Who the fuck made this shit and why? So while the story may be off-putting for most, I still think DMC is a great spin-off for the series. One that we can all sit back and laugh at.
Not in a million years.
Okay, whoever the fuck wrote that scene can suck my left nut. So those were a couple of games from the past that I felt were a little overhated on. I'm sure plenty of people are going to disagree with this video, but I encourage you to play these games if you haven't. Almost all of them are dirt cheap nowadays, so you aren't really risking much by doing so. Like, I got my copy of Final Fantasy XIII for $1 at the Goodwill. Complete in box and everything. If you have played these games and you dislike them, well, I guess your opinion's better than mine. Nah, I'm just yanking your chain. Comment down below and give me your honest thoughts. I'm actually curious to see what you guys think. Also, if you feel that there are any games I should have covered, let me know. I'm always looking for diamonds in the rough. With that being said, I've been Anime Games Aiden, and don't forget to like and subscribe.
I'll make you wish